We are so thrilled to have with us the fabulous Ben Greene about just how the HR community can create more of a culture of allyship. So with no further ado, Ben Greene.
Walk around so not everybody has to crane their neck the whole time. So hi everybody, I'm Ben Greene and I'm here to talk to you all about improving trans inclusion in the workplace. So I know what you're thinking, did Jamie really hire some teenager to come talk to you? I can assure you, you have nothing to worry about. I turned 20 a month ago. I know that I look young, but I actually have years of experience and scores of research to back up everything that I'm going to talk to you about tonight. I'm currently a junior at Brandeis University studying education and computer science, but my experience goes back far further than that, as I talked about earlier in the night. I've spent years leading gay-straight alliances, teaching administrations and health classes, educating my peers, and last spring I gave a TED Talk that some of you have seen, all of which led up to me being here. Public speaking for you guys. I love public speaking. Dream job. So before we go any further, I want to go over some of the syntax that's going to come up in conversations with and about trans people. First off is the word trans itself. It can be used as an adjective or a verb, but never a noun. So you wouldn't say a trans or the transgenders, you'd say a trans person or a person who's transitioning. So I want to show you all this awesome infographic that I saw. So it's called the genderbread person. It's funny, right? And I think it explains visually so well a lot of the different vocabulary words that are going to come up when we talk about gender identity. So let's start off first with your sex, which is biological. XX chromosomes, XY chromosomes, it's what's written on your birth certificate when you're born. Your gender identity up there is an identity or a feeling, so that's a little bit more internal. We don't have time to get into it now, but there are a lot of really fascinating studies that prove the existence of gender in the brain that are all easily accessed with a quick Google search, so I highly recommend looking those up if you're interested. Your gender expression is how you present yourself. It's connected to your identity, but they don't always line up perfectly, so that one's a lot more fluid in terms of how femininely or masculinely a person might choose to act or dress. Your attractions down here are commonly confused for being the same as your identity or being very closely involved, and though there are often a lot of intersections between the two, they're not the same thing. The easiest way to explain it is that your attractions involve your relationships to others. Your identity is your relationship to yourself. So let's go a little more now into some of the different identities a person can have. I came up with this analogy my junior year of high school as a way to explain being trans that was both simple and nuanced at the same time. It isn't going to line up perfectly, it's just an analogy, but I think it's a really fun way to try and understand this topic. So let's imagine that, for simplicity's sake, when people are born, they're born into one of two types of chairs: big tall stools and short thinner chairs. So this chair is going to represent your biological sex. Everybody's born into one of them. When you first sit down, you feel your chair, but if it's comfortable, you kind of stop noticing it, right? Most people don't feel their chairs. They're comfortable and content to sit in their chairs for all of time. This would be someone who identifies as what's called cisgender, which is having a gender identity that's the same as the sex you were assigned at birth. But if you start to think about it, you start to feel it. And if you're uncomfortable, you are really aware of that chair. This feeling of discomfort due to a mismatch between someone's sex and their gender identity is what's known as gender dysphoria. So if you're uncomfortable in the chair you're sitting in, what's the easiest solution? You just get up and move to a different, more comfortable chair. But first, you step back. Evaluate the situation, and then you move to a different chair. Two things to note about the way that I move my chair. One, watch the way that I'm going from one chair to another. I'm not kicking over anybody else's chair. I'm not saying nobody's allowed to sit in a stool because I don't like stools. I just want to sit in a chair that's more comfortable for me. And second, I'm the same person sitting in this chair as I was sitting in that chair. I'm just more comfortable. So this explains the most binary of identities, but we've learned there are a lot more ways to identify than just male or female. Gender is a spectrum from male to female, and people can identify anywhere along that spectrum they want. These people fall under the umbrella term non-binary, which means, you guessed it, not one of the two binary genders, being male or female. So how does this fit into our analogy? Well, maybe somebody wants to sit in a chair that's a little bit shorter than a stool, but still likes it when their feet hang off the ground. Or maybe somebody wants to sit in a chair that has arms. Maybe somebody wants to sit in a chair that's in one type of chair one day and a different type of chair a different day. Maybe someone says, I just don't get it. No matter what chair I sit in, I'm uncomfortable. I would rather just stand up. People can identify as non-binary, gender fluid, gender neutral, or a whole host of other identities. At the end of the day, it's most important to note that there's no right or wrong way to identify as anything. All that matters is that you're comfortable where you're sitting. Hopefully you all are with me so far, but we know the whole rest of the world isn't quite as understanding or ready to learn as all of you. Obviously there are good people, but you also may run into people who are struggling or refuse to support or understand their transgender coworkers. You're good. So in talking to these people, first I would highly recommend trying to use this analogy to explain to them the basis of what their coworkers are going through. If that doesn't work, I do have another suggestion. In this conversation, genitalia were bound to come up, and this is a little bit silly, so feel free to giggle. The best way to go about it is to sit your employee down and lay out a scenario for them. Imagine you're driving home late at night and there's some freak accident and their genitals get chopped off or reversed, or however it is, pose the question to them that if they woke up in the morning and their genitals were reversed, would they then be that sex? Would they have any problems starting to live as a man or a woman? They'll push back on you and say, well, of course not, I'm a man. If you ask them what part of them would still be a man, they'll likely struggle for words. At that point, you can point out to them that the part of them that they just know would be a man is their gender, and it's the part of trans men or women that's men or women too. So that should help a lot with those kind of troublesome situations. So, we know the ways you can help other people be more supportive, but what can you do to be more supportive? Let's start with a hot button issue, bathrooms. The concept of sharing a bathroom with trans people seems to be very jarring for a lot of society, but almost all of the common concerns about it are misconceptions. A recent, very extensive study done at the Williams Institute at UCLA found zero correlation between positive bathroom laws and increased bathroom assaults. Funnily enough, in the last 5 to 10 years, there have been more conservative congressmen arrested for illegal bathroom activities than all trans people. Think about that. Yeah. If your company has the space, it's a great option to have a single-use gender-neutral bathroom like the ones they have here. This ensures that all people feel comfortable using that bathroom, including trans, cis, and non-binary employees. If your company is a bit newer to this and may not have the space for an additional bathroom, you can consider just labeling your bathroom with what's inside of it rather than an arbitrary gender. 2 urinals, 1 stall, 2 sinks. Easy. It's still privacy, it's just easier now. If you have people who are trans at your company, they also may need to be correcting others about the use of incorrect names or pronouns, and these situations can be kind of awkward. So we should think about what we can do to set the right tone at our companies from the start, and what we can do to ease these situations when they do come up. One of the best things that you can do is to normalize saying your pronouns when you introduce yourself. Hi, I'm Ben, I use he, him, his. Easy. I noticed that some of you have your pronouns right in your LinkedIn profiles. Props to Jamie up there, which is so awesome, and I'm totally going to steal. A lot of companies have been including pronouns in their email signatures, name tags, and business cards. All of these are just ways to help make people feel more comfortable. If they would like to specify their pronouns, it's not something that feels weird, it's just something that everyone is doing. It's worth noting that you might need to explain even the concept of gender pronouns to an employee. The mother of a friend of mine was at a conference recently, and when they asked her for her preferred pronouns, she said, I don't know, surprise me. I think that's so funny. You also may have employees who use pronouns other than he or she. Here it is in a dictionary for anyone that doesn't believe it. So a lot of people have a lot of concerns about using the singular they, and as much as the dictionary has tried to help, they're still kind of stuck on it. So if they really push back on it, it's worth pointing out to them that they probably already do use these pronouns. Consider a situation in which you walk into a conference room and there's a laptop on the table. Would you pick it up and walk out into the main office and say, hey, someone left his or her laptop on the table. If you know him or her, let him or her know. No, you would not say that. That would be very embarrassing. You would sound very silly. You would say, hey, someone left their laptop in the conference room. If you know them, please let them know. There's no reason for it to become any harder just because you've seen what the person looks like. So, if people are coming out at your company, there's a good chance they're also going to be changing their names. So let's go over a checklist of all the places they're going to be changing it so that you can help facilitate these changes. First, let's think about the easiest places. Name tags, desk signs, and contact facilities to help them get a new security badge. Next, you'll need to help them update their name and gender in the company's HRIs, and contact the tech department about getting a new username or email address if that's what their job requires. They're also going to need to talk to their coworkers about the new name and pronouns to make sure that they're being used comfortably. So the best thing to do is to speak to them about the way that they would most prefer to go about this. Some might prefer doing it over emails, others may ask you to help set up a meeting with the relevant parties. However they choose to do it, there are just a couple of main points to make sure you hit. Let them know that this person is transitioning to this gender, will now be using these names and these pronouns, and follow up with some resources for if they have any questions. If they have any more questions, let them know that they can come to you to ask them. When trans people come out, we tend to get treated like walking dictionaries. We get swamped with questions that are either very Googleable or very invasive. So for someone like me who makes a living off these questions, they're all great. But for a newly out and minorly overwhelmed accountant at the company you're working with, they're probably just very stressful and, more importantly, not a part of their actual job. Let them get back to accounting. So if you do open yourself up as a sounding board, there is one question that I can pretty much guarantee you'll get asked, and it might even be a question that you're wondering yourselves, which is, what am I allowed to ask? I'm curious, but I don't want to be offensive. For this question, there's a good rule of thumb that I like to tell people that you can tell the employee and use yourself. Simply put, it's just best to imagine the situation reversed. How would you feel if that person verbatim asked the question back to you? Think about how well you know the person, the situation that you're in, what is generally off-limits information to ask. If you feel uncomfortable or would see this as pretty unprofessional, it's probably best just to skip it. Even if you decide that it's worth asking, it's still good practice to preface a question with, hey, do you mind if I ask a question about X? It gives the person an opportunity to say no in a way that's not confrontational and doesn't make the situation uncomfortable for either of you. So we've talked a lot about how to support all of your transgender and non-binary employees, but we also know that people who are at different stages in their transitions might have different needs. So just like gender exists along a spectrum, we can represent where people are in their transitions along two separate spectrums. So this first spectrum represents how out someone is, or how public they are about their identity. In a situation like this, I fall all the way on this end, because I'm being completely transparent about my identity. You don't know everything about me, but you do know that I'm trans. This end over here is not quite as black and white. You could be on this end as someone who has just come out and hasn't told anybody, or as someone who has medically transitioned enough and is passing enough that they don't need to tell people they've transitioned. They can act as if they were born into the correct body and are a cisgendered person. So in spaces where I'm not quite as comfortable, I might fall on this end of the spectrum. So this end here is not a target. People can be wherever along this spectrum they want, and on different parts of the spectrum in different areas of their lives. We shouldn't push anybody to move in any direction, but we should be prepared to help them make these moves if they come to us for that kind of support. The second spectrum involves how much someone has medically transitioned. Like the first one, everyone starts on that left end with none. Also like the first one, there's no one point that's a target. People may have their own personal targets that they're at or working towards, but we don't need to push anybody to move in any directions. So I, for example, have had one surgery and haven't gone on any hormones. That'll put me at about here on the spectrum, and I'm in no rush to go any further. Like the other spectrum as well, people might come to us for help moving from point A to point B along the spectrum. So the first spectrum, we've already talked about the different ways you can help people move along that, either with name changes or talking to their coworkers. So let's go a little more now into how we can support people with their moves along the second spectrum. So one quick thing that I think will be the most helpful to go over for this is to give you an overview of the most common surgeries that someone who's transitioning might have while they're working with you. What that's going to entail for recovery, so you can adjust your time off requests and respond to those appropriately. Also, a thing to note about all of the surgeries we're going to go over, they are technically external procedures and could be classified as cosmetic, but they are crucial to trans people's health and happiness if that's something that they decide that they're hoping to get. So it's best to think of them like any other big surgery that someone you're working with might have. It may take a lot of time to recover and rest up, but they're just to ensure the best and safest possible recovery and result for that employee. So it's best to make sure that we're flexible and communicating with our employees about what kind of time off they're needing, and also keeping the flexibility with how recovery is going and keeping the return date flexible. Some of these most common surgeries, let's start first with someone who is transitioning from female to male, like myself. So this first surgery is known colloquially as top surgery, which essentially reshapes the chest to look more like a typical male chest. It requires about 2 weeks off, maybe 3, depending on if you're a really lazy person like me. And your mom to make you soup all the time. So 2 to 3 weeks off bed rest, and then an additional 3 months off of not lifting up to 20 pounds. It takes about 2 months to get your full range of motion back. So I had this surgery over the summer, and it took me about 2 months to be able to reach the bowls, and I haven't been able to do a push-up in like 10 years. So bottom surgery is a similar concept as top surgery, but as you may have gathered, on the bottom. It involves further reshaping of the body to closer match cis male bodies. This one is not quite as researched for trans men, so it's not quite as common, but still does happen, so we should be prepared for it. It's a lot more intensive, so it'll require 4 to 6 weeks off, unless the job is strenuous, in which case the employee won't be able to come back at all until up to 8 weeks. And then they'll have minimal restrictions on lifting once they're back. For trans women, the top surgery is a lot easier. So the bed rest will only be 1 week, but they'll still have similar restrictions on lifting as trans men, so up to 3 months not lifting anything really heavy or doing any big reaching. Bottom surgery for trans women is much more developed, so it is more common, and the recovery time for that is about 4 to 6 weeks of bed rest. So it's also important to note that people who identify as non-binary may also have these surgeries to help them feel more comfortable in their bodies. One thing that's not surgical, but is still common in people who are transitioning, is something called HRT, or hormone replacement therapy, which essentially involves replacing the dominant estrogen with testosterone, or testosterone with estrogen. And though this won't require a lot of time off besides the occasional doctor's appointment, you should be prepared to see some changes in your employee. The first year on hormones is commonly referred to as second puberty, and yes, it's just as bad as the first time. So, Jamie brought up a really interesting question to me when we were talking about the content of the speech, which is, when someone tells you they're getting surgery, what do you say to them? What is or isn't appropriate? Like the other surgeries that employees may have, you shouldn't ask any more questions than the information that's pertinent to you. That being said, it's a really big deal. We could spend anywhere between 4 and 20 years dreaming of having these surgeries, especially because of how hard it is to find insurance coverage and how hard it is to find a good surgeon. So it's a really big deal, and it is certainly more than appropriate to congratulate them on getting to this point. Another note about the medical information: even if someone isn't having surgeries, hopefully they're still seeing regular doctors. Though for regular employees it may only require an hour or 2 off for a doctor's appointment, it can be really hard to find regular practitioners that are trained in treating trans patients. Even about regular things, an appointment with someone who doesn't know anything about trans issues can be really upsetting. So we may have to drive additional distances to find somebody who's qualified and educated enough to work with us. The surgeons we talked about before that perform these operations are also few and far between. Some states could have one surgeon that does it, others could have none. Especially now that we're at risk of it becoming legal for trans people to get turned away from medical care facilities, just be aware of that when you're granting time off requests for doctor's appointments, that we may need to travel a little further to find someone that fits us. So one final note about all this medical stuff. I only knew about the surgery that I had myself, which I researched heavily. The rest of them I didn't really know about. So I thought it would be fun that while I did all the research for that section of the speech, if I set a timer on how long it took me to get all this information. For all of that, it was 22 minutes. So I know it feels like I'm telling you a lot of information and you're not going to remember it all, and I probably haven't covered everything in the world, because how could any person do that? So it might feel a little overwhelming, but the good news is that there is so much available and accessible information out there that if there's anything you ever feel like you want or need to learn more about, it is fantastically easy to do so, and will be really appreciated by your employees. So that's the note I want to end on. Just continuing to educate yourself will make a world of difference for all the people that you're working with. Continuing to educate yourself. In addition, wherever you're working, it's really helpful to look up support resources for LGBT people in the local area. So if someone comes to you and seems to be having a hard time, you have directions you can point them in. Besides that, it's best just to remember that we're all unique people with unique needs from you. So the best thing you can do is ask what we need, and very easy, is to ask what we need and to do what you can to provide that. All right, that's all I got for you. What questions do you have for me?